Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, November 21st, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. That elite's concern for profits has meant that the center of attention for American foreign policy for more than a century has been Eurasia, the landmass from Eastern Europe to East Asia, not Europe or the Western Hemisphere. Since at least the open door policy of 1899, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of Eurasia by the American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, conquering their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere in the Second World War. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone in 1941. The U.S. lost perhaps 500,000 people in the Second World War as a whole. Russia lost perhaps 27 million in the war against Germany. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia and the retarding of its economic development. The American task is more difficult today than at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China and their effective alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's why the U.S. has 1,000, yes, 1,000, military bases around Russia and China. Russia has 15 bases outside its territory. China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country in the world. The situation was described in 1948 in a secret State Department memorandum by the liberal diplomat and historian George Kennan. He wrote in 1948, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment." By we, of course, he means the United States. "Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction." Close quote. That's the State Department in 1948 and the account of the world that the U.S. would dominate after the Second World War. From World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain that economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting, Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program of modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals, from Germany to China. The U.S. has been at war almost continuously since World War II, putting down putting down challenges to its economic control of the world. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the 1,000 U.S. military bases ringing Eurasia. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons and make them more usable. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which is dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a sketch of a better account tonight on AWARE on the Air, beginning with some comments on the news of the week. Jeffrey Sinclair, the editor of Counterpunch, a political website that I recommend highly to everyone, writes that PBS, the network, public broadcasting system, has replaced the Charlie Rose Show with Antiques Roadshow. Charlie has been caught up in the anti-harassment campaign that began with Harvey Weinstein. The question, St. Clair asks, is will anyone notice the difference between the Charlie Rose Show and the Antiques Roadshow? It seems to me the Charlie Rose Show and the Antiques Roadshow, even the names are confusing. There seems to me that's a reasonable question given the nonsense that the Charlie Rose Show has been giving us all these years. Point 2 from the week's news, you've heard here from us, notably from my colleague Karen Aram, about the situation in Myanmar, Burma, and how that's bound up with the conflict between between China rather, and the U.S. over the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiatives, the Chinese transportation system that is designed to lead to the economic integration of Asia. it was announced this week that the Pope, Pope Francis, is going to Myanmar, going to Burma, which of course has been racked by the controversy over the Rohingya, the Muslim peoples who have been persecuted and driven out of Myanmar, and the question about their status within that country. I was interested in seeing that a leading political commentator of the American Catholic Church, writes for the journal America, says that next week when the Pope makes his visit to Myanmar, he risks either compromising his moral authority or putting in danger the Christians of that country. It's an interesting notion. It's strange to hear that from the political commentator of the journal America. He continues, I have great admiration for the Pope and his abilities, but someone should have talked him out of making this trip. We'll talk about this a little next week with reference to the ongoing situation with the Rohingya people in Myanmar. What's at stake here for the U.S. is the Chinese extension of its Belt and Road Initiative, its economic connection, transportation connection, through Burma. The U.S. is doing what it can to hinder the Chinese plans, and there are some who have suggested that the stirring up of the controversy over the Rohingya has behind it an American attempt to make things difficult for the Chinese. It wouldn't be the first time. The news of foreign policy in this country is very much in the hands of people who buy the American account of the world, but it's sometimes worthwhile to read, as it were, what they are saying to themselves as we try to get a better picture of what's really going on. I have in mind here the two journals that are put out by the American foreign policy establishment, one called, helpfully enough, Foreign Policy, and the other one called Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs is the older of the two, the more establishment of the two. Foreign Policy is the young liberal one, but they are both overwhelmingly supportive of that project that I was talking about a moment ago, the project of maintaining the disparity between the United States and the rest of the world, the control of the world economy that the U.S. has enjoyed since the generation after the Second World War. Nevertheless, it's worthwhile to see what the establishment is saying to itself. What does the American foreign policy establishment think is news, and how do they interpret it? Foreign Policy, the journal, helpfully publishes each day an account of what it thinks is news, and I've taken to abstracting that account and making some comments about it. I'll post this to the Facebook page for Aware, and you can see it there. This week's edition includes the comment, for the first time in 6 years, the number of U.S. troops killed in overseas operations. That's the way they talk. Overseas operation means those wars that America, the 8 wars that America is carrying on around the world. But for the first time in 6 years, the number of U.S. troops killed in overseas operations has increased over the previous year. Overseas operations is the euphemism of the foreign policy establishment for illegal U.S. war-making around the world. So far this year, 31 service members have died in actions overseas. Those are the ones we were told about. We often find out later that there are more. But that's what the Defense Department has said. Last year, the total was 26, down 2 from 2015. Now, we should remember here that the U.S. wars are today examples of what President Obama called leading from behind, that is, getting other people to fight them, the same way the U.S. supported jihadists from Saudi Arabia and Qatar to attack Syria. Many more people died in that than the 24 that the U.S. is willing to talk about in terms of American casualties. But of course, the brilliance, if that's the word, of the Obama war making is that it reduces American casualties by using foreigners or by using drones. President Obama killed 5,000 people with his drone assassinations, but the only Americans who died were Americans that were targeted by the Obama administration, like the family of al-Rabi, who himself and his children were targets of American assassinations. The Trump administration, following on that, staged a raid into Yemen at the beginning of their tenure and managed to kill another relative of the same family. 16 years into the war in Afghanistan, and the commander of U.S. troops there says he needs just 2 more years, and he thinks Kabul might be able to control about 80% of the country, if all goes well. That's the way they talk. Some of the 3,000 American troops President Donald Trump has sent to Afghanistan will embed with Afghan units on the ground, calling in airstrikes and artillery on Taliban positions and advising local forces in the fight. So we'll probably have more American casualties to talk about when leading from behind gives way to embedding. When Trump came to office, at the end of the Obama administration, that is, the U.S. had 11,000 troops in Afghanistan in the war that began 16 years ago with the American invasion. The U.S. had 11,000 troops in Afghanistan plus 26,000 contractors, as we call them. They're not American troops, they're mercenaries. And the U.S. hires these people and sends them into the war zone to carry on the war. They are not, the word contractors suggests they're guys building things, and maybe they are, but the things they're building are military fortifications. There are also perhaps 5,000 NATO troops, European troops, as part of the American Expeditionary Force in Afghanistan. Speaking with reporters on Monday, General John W. Nicholson, Jr. also said that B-52 bombers and F-22 warplanes have kicked off an effort to bomb opium production centers in Afghanistan in an effort to deprive the Taliban of hundreds of millions in revenue from the drug trade. Now, there's a great story here you're waiting to be told and suppressed by the American military, and that's the extent to which the American military is sponsoring the drug trade, that is, opium production in Afghanistan, and the success of the Taliban when it ruled Afghanistan in suppressing that trade. It was only after the American invasion in 2001 that the opium production began again, and Afghanistan began to export opium again. These were our allies, the leaders of the forces that the U.S. was arriving in Afghanistan to aid against the Taliban, which had ruled Afghanistan since the Russian withdrawal. South Korea and Japan on Tuesday both said they welcomed U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to put North Korea back on a list of state sponsors of terrorism, saying it would ramp up pressure on Pyongyang to denuclearize the Korean peninsula. This story is, once again, just remarkably ill-reported in this country, and not by accident. The Chinese told Trump, when he was there, what they've been saying all along, that the denuclearization of North Korea could be accomplished by the so-called double freeze. That is, China would prevail upon North Korea to stop its development of nuclear weapons, and the U.S. would stop its war provocations and maneuvers in South Korea. perfectly reasonable agreement, it would seem. It's an agreement that has indeed been offered by the North Koreans to the Obama administration and refused by the Obama administration. But that's not the account we hear in this country. The account we hear in this country is of a madman who might develop nuclear weapons that could reach New Orleans. The real situation, once again, is misrepresented in the American media, and the solution is obvious. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad traveled outside of his country, Syria, for the second time since his country descended into civil war in 2015. Interesting way to put it. The reason for the civil war, of course, is the ongoing support of the jihadists by the United States. President Assad went to Russia for a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin not hoisted, maybe he lifted him up, but I mean what I meant to say was that he was his host. Putin hosted Assad in the Black Sea resort of Sochi on Monday ahead of a summit between Russia, Turkey, and Iran and a new round of Syria peace talks in Geneva. Unless Saudi Arabia ends its blockade of ports and airports in Yemen, thousands more Yemeni civilians will die of famine in the coming months, the United Nations says. The warning came a day after the International Committee of the Red Cross said 2.5 million people in Yemen's crowded cities had no access to clean water, raising the risk that a cholera epidemic will spread. And once again, this is a result of American policy. We support the Saudis in their attack on Yemen, and as a result, there have been mass deaths that once again should be on our conscience. A group of State Department employees, U.S. State Department employees, have accused Secretary of State Rex Tillerson with breaking federal law. In June, Tillerson broke with the unanimous recommendation of a group of top state officials when he excluded Iraq, Myanmar, and Afghanistan from a U.S. list of offenders in the use of child soldiers. Now, this fight within the State Department is nothing new. Remember that 50 State Department officials signed a petition in the last days of the Obama administration saying the Obama administration should do more to kill people in the Middle East. We were not fighting terrorism vigorously enough. These are the diplomats in the State Department who are saying that the vicious wars that the executive are carrying along should be increased. So it's not too surprising that we hear dissident views from the establishment in Washington. This is sometimes what people call the deep state, that is the ongoing and continuous organization of American foreign policy. Now they're after Rex Tillerson, and the internal fight gives us some chance, perhaps, of seeing something about how policy is made in the U.S. government. During a photo op, a meeting with reporters, with the Gaddafi foreign minister in Washington on Monday, Tillerson rebuffed reports the State Department was suffering record low morale. Obviously, the State Department is suffering record low morale because Tillerson et al. Are not prosecuting the war that the State Department supports vigorously enough, although they're certainly doing it vigorously. The Defense Department's Inspector General had some nice things to say about the Air Force's plan to build its next generation B-21 stealth bomber and its strategy to avoid the customary cost overruns and production delays that tend to accompany big acquisition products. Remember, I'm reading here the account from the magazine Foreign Policy, which is, how shall we say it, very regime-friendly. This is what the defense contractors and the military want you to hear. The program is shrouded in secrecy, but the inspector, of course, we can't talk to people openly, about the immense amounts of money we're spending to kill people. But the Inspector General's report praised the Air Force risk management and acquisition strategies for the project, saying it, quote, had clearly defined requirements for the bomber, which includes an ability to fly the aircraft unmanned. That's too easy. We don't have to go on with that. Iraqi Kurdistan's top foreign affairs official is asking the U.S. to play a bigger role in mediating the ongoing dispute between Baghdad and Erbil, that is the Kurdish capital, following a Kurdish independence referendum and the capture of the disrupted city of Kirkuk by Iraqi security forces. The Kurdistan regional government's top foreign policy official, Fala Mustafa Bakir, tells the Wall Street Journal he's asked the State Department to appoint a special envoy for the issue and wants help negotiating a ceasefire between Iraqi and Kurdish forces. Okay, to penetrate that a bit, to say something about what's going on there, the U.S. has sponsored various Iraqi groups in order to maintain the opposition to the Syrian government, which the U.S. has been trying to overthrow now for several years because it refuses to follow orders that the U.S. issues to Middle Eastern countries about oil flows and their relationships with one another. Syria drew the ire of the United States primarily because it was allied with Iran. And Iran is a bête noire for the U.S. in the region. Going back years, the U.S. has been torturing Iran since the U.S. overthrew Iran's government in 1953 in a CIA-engineered coup and impressed a dictator on the country, a dictator who was eventually overthrown. And the U.S. has not forgiven Iran for overthrowing the Shah, for overthrowing the dictator in 1973. The Treasury Department says that Iran's covert operations arm has been smuggling restricted printing gear from Europe to support a large-scale counterfeiting operation churning out Yemeni currency. I don't know how seriously to take any of that, but it does suggest to us what's going on here in terms of the American hostility to Iran and its support, therefore, for the murderous attack on Yemen by Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, the State Department is giving a heads up to a plan to sell $75 billion worth of Javelin anti-tank missiles to Georgia. He doesn't mean Roy Moore's home. He means Georgia in the Caucasus, the country of Georgia in the Caucasus, against which the U.S. has been in Georgia, the U.S. has been supporting war provocations against Russia. Russia and Georgia fought some time ago in another programmatic war encouraged by the U.S. The anti-Russian war provocations throughout Eastern Europe, like the anti-Chinese war provocations in the Western Pacific, continue. They continued, indeed, were encouraged by the Obama administration, particularly when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. This is not something most Americans are aware of. The notion that the U.S. was provoking Russia and China throughout the last administration was not generally known in this country, but it was known by the people who took these things seriously. The best indication was that when President Trump began attacking these activities, these war provocations, the neoconservatives, the supporters of more American war, who had been comfortably ensconced in the Republican Party, fled the Republican Party and began to support Hillary Clinton's campaign because it seemed clear that Hillary Clinton was a committed warmonger against Russia and China, and it looked like Trump wasn't. The political history of the last year, the first year of the Trump administration, has been the effort of the deep state, of the political establishment, to convince Trump to go back to the war provocations of the Obama-Clinton administration, and indeed it seems that they have succeeded. You're watching Aware on the Air. We are looking at a number of the things that are going on around the world that you don't hear much about in the American media. And we will press on with that for a few minutes and finish up with some comments on a slightly different matter, a Thanksgiving program, if you like. What I want to turn to now is a piece on the Middle East from Patrick Coburn, the leading English language reporter on the Middle East, who writes for The Independent in London. Coburn has for years been the premier correspondent for English publications. And this week he gives us a piece entitled, "The Greatest Threats to the Middle East Are Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman." And if you don't know who Jared Kushner or Mohammed bin Salman is, it may be worthwhile to find out in terms of what's going to happen in the Middle East and the prospects for war in the Middle East in the coming months. In Iraq, for the first time since Saddam Hussein, the former ruler of Iraq, started his war with Iran in 1980, encouraged by the United States, the prospects look positive, writes Coburn. The central government of Iraq, is stronger than before, defeating ISIS in the 9-month-long siege of Mosul and ending the move towards secession of Iraqi Kurdistan by peacefully reoccupying Kirkuk. That's the oil-producing country that the Kurds, city that the Kurds had taken control of, and other disputed territories. Substantial successes these certainly are, but what has really changed the political landscape of Iraq is that there is no longer a community, party, or faction fighting the central government with financial and military aid from foreign backers. For once, Iraq has good relations with all the neighboring states. Remember, this is Iraq, who the U.S. Invaded and destroyed in 2003 and produced a massive death and political organizations such as ISIS as a result. But the country, along with the rest of the Middle East, is vulnerable to unexpected and unpredictable events. Of course, these are always a possibility anywhere, but never more than at present, because of the strange character change of two traditionally conservative powers in the region, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Previously committed to preserving the political status quo, both have become mercurial and prone to saw off the branch on which they are sitting. Now, Patrick Coburn is saying this is true of the American government and the Trump administration and the Saudi Arabian government under the control of their new effective king, Mohammed bin Salman, normally referred to even in the news as MBS. So between Trump and MBS, the situation has changed to some extent in the Middle East, says Coburn, because of the character of these two leaders. The real danger of to peace in the Mideast comes from a combination of three people: Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, Trump's son-in-law and Middle East envoy Jared Kushner, and Bibi Netanyahu in Israel, the Prime Minister of Israel. Probably the Saudis and the Americans exaggerate the willingness of Netanyahu and Israel to go to war. Netanyahu has always been strong on bellicose rhetoric, but cautious about real military conflict, except in Gaza, which was more massacre than war. Israel's military strength tends to be exaggerated, and its army has not won a war outright since 1973. Previous engagements with Hezbollah, the Shia party in Lebanon, have gone badly. Israeli generals know that the threat of military action can be more effective than its use in maximizing Israeli political influence, but that actually going to war means losing control of the situation. They will know the saying of the 19th century German chief of staff, Helmut von Moltke, that, quote, "no plan survives contact with the enemy," close quote. But even if the Israelis do not intend to fight Hezbollah or Iran, this doesn't mean that they would not like somebody else to do so for them. Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi told me in an interview earlier this month that his greatest fear was a U.S.-Iranian confrontation fought out in Iraq. This could happen directly or through proxies, but in either case would end the present fragile peace. On the optimistic side, U.S. policy in Iraq and Syria is largely run by the Pentagon and not the White House, and has not changed much since President Obama's days. It has been successful in its aim of destroying ISIS and the self-declared caliphate. The wars in Iraq and Syria already have their winners and losers. President Bashar al-Assad stays in power in Damascus, as does a Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. An Iranian-backed substantially Shia axis in 4 countries, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, stretches from the Afghan border to the Mediterranean. This is the outcome of the war since 2011, which is not going to be reversed except by a U.S. land invasion, as happened in Iraq in 2003. The great danger in the Middle East today is that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Jared Kushner appear to have a skewed and unrealistic understanding of the world around them. Inspector Clouseau seems to have a greater influence on Saudi policy than Machiavelli, going by the antics surrounding the forced resignation of Saad Hariri as Prime Minister of Lebanon. This sort of thing is not going to frighten the Iranians or Hezbollah. The signs are that Iran has decided to go a long way to avoid confrontation with the U.S. In Iraq, it's reported that it will support the re-election of Abadi as Prime Minister. He's Prime Minister now, which is also what the U.S. wants. Iran knows it has come out on the winning side in Iraq and Syria and does not need to flaunt its success. It may also believe that the Crown Prince is using anti-Iranian nationalist rhetoric to secure his own power and does not intend to do much about it. Nobody has much to gain from another war in the Middle East, but wars are usually started by those who miscalculate their own strengths and interests. Both the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have become wild cards in the regional pack. The sort of neocon and right-wing think tankers who in 2003 were saying that a war with Iraq would be a dawdle are back in business in Washington, pushing for a war with Iran, and are stronger than ever. I probably need to translate that phrase from the British. Dawdle in British slang means an easy job, an easy task. What Coburn means here, what Coburn says, is the sort of neocon and right-wing think tankers, the deep state, if you like, in the U.S., who in 2003 were saying that a war with Iraq would be a dawdle, be easy, would be a walkover, are back in business in Washington pushing for a war with Iran and are stronger than ever. Now, this is a perennial problem in Washington, and Coburn, if anything, minimizes it, I think, in this article. Perhaps it should be minimized, but the danger certainly is always there, as he admits. The wars in the Middle East should be ending, but they could just be entering a new phase. Leaders in the U.S. and Saudi Arabia may not want a new war, but they may just blunder into one. That's Patrick Coburn, the English correspondent, the Anglo-Irish correspondent writing from the Middle East, and the peculiar events taking place, notably in Saudi Arabia, seem to me to suggest that he's right when he says the danger of war in the region is still quite serious in spite of the apparent lid that has been placed on the most devastating aspects of that war, notably the American support, or the American attempt to overthrow the government in Syria, and the development of ISIS, the Islamic State, and the caliphate that it declared. You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 47th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extreme global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks of the Islamic State and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks, by the way, to my colleague, Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. You can see No's notes prepared for this program on the blog newsfromneptune.com. I should mention also that Aware will be at the Holiday Market in Lincoln Square this Saturday with books, anti-war materials, information, and a willingness of Aware members to talk about the political topics that are not being talked about in the American media. You can see the Facebook page for Aware if you want to see what our plans are for this thing, for this Saturday conference, or market. It's a market, not a conference. There are also advertisements for some real conferences, by the way, on that Facebook page, including one in December in Baltimore on the 1,000 military bases that the U.S. has around the world. And also, you can see a link to the anti-war teach-in that Aware staged last month and has been put together for broadcast by the omnicompetent Jason Liggett, our producer here at Aware on the Air. Our show is, in fact, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Anders Scaleroy, thanks to whom this program and others like it are available on YouTube. We will go in the last minutes of this program to a video of a lecture. I encourage you to watch the whole thing if you find the first part interesting, about the peace writer Thomas Merton. This is a Thanksgiving program, if you like, in that Merton was a major figure in the anti-war movement of the 60s in terms of the things he wrote about in those days and the influence that he had on the anti-war movement. This presentation tells you something about who he was and what he thought. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
I just want to give you a little bit of background. My name is Karen Pascal. I'm with the Henry Nouwen Society. And we shared last night how this conference has been a real collaboration between Dr. Paul Pearson from the Thomas Merton Center, Jim Hackney and Dean Greg Sterling from the Yale Divinity School, and the Henry Nouwen Society. It's been a coming together of many good things, and we're just delighted. You missed one lovely little treasure last night. We had Sue Mosteller. Sister Sue Mosteller gave us a call to conference, and it involved tuning your spiritual GPS to basically hear the directions that God has for your life out of this day, out of this gathering. So I would encourage you all to do just that. And in order to do it, why don't we just have a moment or two of silence right now, where we really ask God to quiet us, and we take a moment to listen. And then I'm going to introduce our speaker. As Paul Pearson of the Thomas Merton Center and James Hackney of YDS and myself from the Henry Nouwen Society planned the event, we wanted to be sure we would find speakers or subjects that would bring together both Merton and Nouwen. And we agreed that Robert Ellsberg would be an excellent choice. Robert has served for 30 years as the editor-in-chief and publisher of Orbis Books, where he has written and edited a number of award-winning books, including the 3-time Catholic Press Associate Award winner, Blessed Among All Women. Robert met our criteria because he has published many books on or by or about Thomas Merton and Henry Nouwen. Robert came to know Henry while serving as the managing editor of the Catholic Worker in the late 1970s. They overlapped at Harvard Divinity School, where Robert received a master's degree in theology, and later, Robert and Henry collaborated on a number of books. He was a trusted editor and friend who worked closely with Henry Nouwen in his last years. After Henry's death, Robert served as one of the trustees of the Henry Nouwen Literary Estate. As a publisher, he brought such wisdom and experience to that role. Together with Sister Sue Mosteller and Nathan Ball, they addressed many of the issues that arose around this huge legacy of work entrusted to their care. More recently, Robert has edited several books by Dorothy Day, including her letters and diaries. His books include All Saints, The Saint's Guide to Happiness, and Blessed Among Us. He's also served as the general editor of the Orbis series Modern Spiritual Masters and has edited volumes by Thich Nhat Hanh, Flannery O'Connor, Charles de Foucault, and Carlo Carretto. All Saints. Well, that's one of my personal favorites, I have to admit. Fortunately, you gave me a copy, and I just love this book. And every single day you meet another saint. But I want to have some of the things that have been written about it. I want to share that with you. Henry Nouwen wrote, "This book is a treasure. I consider Robert Ellsberg to be one of the most significant spiritual writers in the United States. And this book puts him right in the center of contemporary spiritual literature." Jim Forrest, who you'll be hearing from later today, wrote about this book. Each entry has a rare gift for each entry in All Saints is as crisp as freshly picked lettuce. Isn't that lovely? Robert Ellsberg has a rare gift for getting a great deal into a small space and always getting what matters. I would agree, and because of this, I anticipate today that as Robert speaks to us about the home where I have never been, the restless journeys of Thomas Merton and Henry Nouwen, he is going to give us what matters most. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Ellsberg.
Thank you so much. That takes me back a ways. Henry he wrote that fulsome praise of my book, I think after I'd sent him an entry for Vincent van Gogh to appear in my Book of Saints, and I think that I had him from that. I remember, well, it's amazing for me to even be here, thinking it was 40 years ago when I first met Henry. He was a professor here at Yale. I was a very young editor of the Catholic Worker, and he invited me to one of those gatherings at his home that Jim described last night, where he proudly displayed his culinary gifts, which consisted of mixing two different kinds of Campbell's tomato soup together. It was his own recipe. He had invented that. Let me go back a little farther. In 1968, as Thomas Merton embarked on his journey to Asia, he wrote in his journal, "May I not come back without having settled the great affair and found also the great compassion. I am going home, to the home where I have never been in this body." Merton had to spend his early life on a grand tour that took him, as he summarized in the final paragraph of the Seven-Story Mountain, quote, "from Prague to Bermuda to St. Antonin to Oakham to London to Cambridge to Rome to New York to Columbia to Corpus Christi to St. Bonaventure to the Cistercian Abbey of the poor men who labor in Gethsemane." And the implication was that that was the final resting stop. To what purpose? He answered that implicit question in the words of God that you probably remember, that you may become the brother of God and learn to know the Christ of the burnt men. Though he remained at the Abbey of Gethsemane for the last 27 years of his life, that was certainly not the end of his journey, though now more interior than geographical. He acknowledged as much in the Latin motto that concludes his autobiography, "Sit finis libri, non finis quarendi." Here ends the book, but not the searching. Truer words were never spoken. In fact, Merton's life continued to be marked by a restless search that continued until his death. In his struggle to plunge deeper into the divine mystery and the depths of his own vocation, he traveled onward toward his true home, the home where he had never been in this body. In 1995, Henry Nouwen set off on a sabbatical journey from his work as chaplain to the L'Arche Daybreak community in Toronto. He had also lived in many places: his native Holland, the Menninger Institute in Kansas, Notre Dame, Yale, the Abbey of the Genesee in New York, a mission parish in Lima, Peru, Harvard Divinity School, Trolly, France. A great restlessness drove him from one place to another. Only in the last 10 years of his life at Daybreak did he find something that felt pretty much like home, and yet this did not resolve the restless search for peace, for a sense of belonging, or what Merton called the great compassion. I think that both Merton and Nouwen, as spiritual explorers, came to a place of recognizing that there is no final destination in this life. Their home was the journey itself, a journey that would never be entirely completed in this body. In his final journal, Nouwen wrote about the little while of our lives, such a precious time. Quote, "It is a time of purification and sanctification," he wrote, "a time to be prepared for the great passage to the permanent house of God." In the end, neither Merton nor Nouwen returned from their final journeys, but I think each of them, in their struggles to remain faithful and to trust in God's loving providence, opened a path to holiness for all those who struggle amidst life's doubts, unresolved questions, and uncertainties. Merton first came to the attention of the world in 1948 through the publication of his book, The Seven-Story Mountain, the autobiography he wrote in his early years as a Trappist monk. It told a story by turns funny and sad of his search for his true identity and home, of his orphaned childhood, his education in France, England, and New York, and of the pride and selfishness that brought nothing but unhappiness to himself and others. And he told how his search had led him ultimately to the Catholic Church, and finally, on the eve of World War II, to the Trappist Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. On viewing the silent monks dressed in their white habits and kneeling in prayer in the chapel, Merton had exclaimed, "This is the true center of America." In entering the monastery, Merton not only felt he was leaving the world and giving up everything, he was also leaving behind a certain Thomas Merton with all his anxious desire to be somebody, his demanding ego, his tendency to sarcasm and scorn for people who didn't meet his standards. With the anonymous monks in their white habits, he intended to drown to the world, to be invisible, a nobody. It didn't quite go that way. The Seven-Story Mountain turned out to be an astonishing bestseller, selling 600,000 copies in cloth in the first year. Merton was suddenly the most famous monk in America, an irony that was not lost on him. And yet his superiors felt his writing had something to offer the world, and they ordered him to keep at it, and so he did. And there followed books of poetry, lives of Trappist saints, which he later termed awful, books on monasticism, and an increasing stream of books on prayer and the spiritual life. If he ever doubted whether he was truly a monk, there was never any doubt that he was truly a writer. Yet for all the books he would go on to produce, in the public mind, he was eternally fixed at the point where his memoir ended. As a young monk with his cowl pulled over his head, happily convinced that in joining an austere medieval monastery, he had fled the modern world, never to return. It was difficult for readers to appreciate that this picture represented only the beginning of Merton's journey as a monk. One aspect of the book that he particularly came to regret was the attitude of pious scorn directed at the world and its unfortunate denizens. He had seemed to regard the monastery as a secluded haven set apart from the, quote, news and desires and appetites and conflicts that bedeviled ordinary humanity. In 1948, an errand into Louisville occasioned one of his first trips outside the monastery. In his journal, he noted piously, "Going into Louisville the other day, I wasn't struck by anything in particular, although I felt completely alienated from everything in the world and all its activity. Though he felt the people were, quote, worthy of sympathizing with, overall he judged the excursion boring." What a difference a decade would make. 10 years later, in 1958, he records in his journals the radically different impact of another errand into Louisville. Quote, "On the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, an intersection that has recently been rechristened Thomas Merton Plaza, he experienced a moment of mystical awareness that inspired one of the most famous passages in all his books. He writes, "I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. The whole illusion of a separate holy existence is a dream, not that I question the reality of my vocation or of my monastic life, but the conception of separation from the world that we have in the monastery too easily presents itself as a complete illusion. The illusion that by making vows, we become a different species of beings, pseudo-angels, spiritual men, men of interior life, what have you." This passage ends with the marvelous words, "There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. There are no strangers. The gate of heaven is everywhere." I want to underline those words. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. In that dream of separateness, he is describing an understanding of holiness that had animated